A few friends and I were going out on a camping trip that was going to span the course of 4 days. It would most consist of hiking and fishing on the lake. We had gone on this trip for the past 4 summers in a row, and every year we chose to go up to the campground toward the end of the season, in the hopes of it not being overly crowded. However, this year we had to change the plans a bit to accommodate a few people in our group who could only make the trip in July. So we ended up at the campground during one of its busiest weeks. But that didn't bother anyone too much. Overall, we were all just happy to be there. In fact, because there were other people on the lake with us, we managed to find out about a couple of other trails nearby that we hadn't yet explored. One of which included a large cave that was said to have gone back nearly a mile into the mountain. And the best part was that it was rather a large cave, so we didn't have to worry about squeezing through too many tight spaces. So on our second day, we all decided to go on a hike through the trail that would bring us into the cave. We figured it would be a ton of fun, and for the most part, we were right. The inside of the cave was way bigger than we expected it to be, and with our flashlights on our phones, we could see everything around us. Perhaps the best part was how cool it was the deeper we could go into the cave compared to the stifling heat that came from standing in the sun. As we made it deeper into the cave, I remember my friend Ryan saying how he was starting to get the creeps, and a few others agreed with him. So we decided that we would only go a bit further in before turning around and heading back to the campground. We pressed on a little further, and at that point, I'd been standing toward the back of the group when out of nowhere, we all just stopped. The few people in the front of the group all let out screams that echoed back throughout the cave, and as everyone began to scramble, I caught a glimpse of what they were screaming at. Lying on the floor was the body of someone, and it wasn't entirely clear at first as to where the blood was coming from, but there was clearly a pool of blood on the floor around it. We all sprinted out of the cave as fast as we could and got a hold of the authorities, which included the police and campground security. After a couple of hours, we were notified that the body had been identified as someone who had been there with their family on vacation and had gone missing earlier that day. The body was found with multiple stab wounds and lacerations across the upper body. All of us felt pretty uncomfortable staying at the campgrounds and actually got 2 hotel rooms for the night. We weren't given any more information on the body that we found in that cave, but we had to leave and had chosen not to use that campground anymore. It just doesn't feel quite right. If you have ever visited the mountains of Utah, you might know that they are riddled with cave systems and caverns that make for great exploring and hiking trips. This was me and my cousin David's favorite thing to do when I would visit his house for the summer. It was a yearly thing that would happen every summer. I would get dropped off at my aunt and uncle's house toward the end of June, and I would spend a few weeks there with a bunch of my cousins. A lot of time was spent out on the lake and walking the trails, but any chance that we could, me and my cousin would go traversing through the local systems that he knew about. Well, this past summer was no different, except we learned a very valuable lesson about paying attention to the weather. After spending about 2 weeks at my cousin's this past summer, we finally had some time to go out in the trails, and since David had been taking up this new cave system that he had found, we figured we would check it out. Every time he talked about this particular set of caves and tunnels, he always talked about how tight some of the spots were that we were going to have to squeeze through. But he promised that the beautiful chambers inside would be more than worth it, and once I saw them for myself, he wasn't wrong. After letting our family know where we were going, I remember my uncle telling us to look out for the weather. We didn't pay the comment any mind, and once we headed out, it was only about a 45-minute drive to the trail that led us to the cave entrance. And when we first walked up to the threshold of the cave system, it honestly didn't seem that special. It was rather a wide entrance, and from the looks of it, the tunnel systems weren't going to get nearly as tight as David had told me. After about 20 minutes of smooth walking from chamber to chamber, however, the 2 of us did eventually come up to a place where most explorers in the cave would stop. In front of us was a wall where the only way through it would be to get into our stomachs and crawl through a space that was no more than a foot wide at the most. David and I looked at each other and both agreed that this was what we had come here for. After crawling and wiggling our way through the narrow space that dipped up and down as we moved forward, we eventually made it through to one of the large chambers that David had told me about. And I mean, when I say that he wasn't wrong, it's hard to describe why it was so beautiful, but to be in a space that had been practically untouched by mankind was truly something amazing. After taking in the experience, the 2 of us pressed on further for about an hour of exploring. Throughout that hour, we would squeeze through more narrow spaces that were making their way down, deeper into the cave system. There were actually a few occasions on the way in that we thought we might get stuck or wedged. But after a bit of pushing, we were able to squeeze through. And after a while, we both came to the decision that we had seen enough, and it was probably time to head back. It wasn't until we began crawling back through that both of us realized that we might be in some serious trouble. You see, as I said, the tunnels that we had been crawling through were ultimately bringing us down deeper into the earth. And the reason my uncle had warned us about the weather was that there was a huge rainstorm that had been heading out way. And had we paid more attention and known about this, David and I would have never entered the caves that day. As we continued to crawl through one of the tighter cracks and toward one of the chambers that were in the direction of the exit, David and I began to notice a small puddle of water forming on the path. And as we made it into the chamber, it was clear that we had been trapped in by water that had flooded into the cave. The two of us began to panic, as we quickly realized that there was a chance that the water would keep coming in, and that we had nowhere to go. There was no way that we could crawl back out of the tunnels, as we don't know how much of it had filled with water, and if it would be passable or not. All we could do was wait as the water slowly trickled by, and hope that the crevices leading out of the chamber would clear up, indicating that the flooding had stopped. David and I did our best to stay calm for the hours that we had been trapped in that chamber, but to our luck, the water did eventually clear up as it continued to trickle past us. The rain outside must have stopped, and after taking out time to think about our options, the two of us decided that we should try to crawl out. We still had about 20 minutes of crawling and squeezing through the tight and narrow passes before we finally made it back to the walkable trails that led us out of the cave. To our surprise, my aunt and uncle, David's parents, were waiting right at the entrance of the cave with a couple of emergency workers. After we didn't make it back by the time the storm started, my uncle knew that something wasn't quite right and decided to get a few of his friends together to form a search party in case something had happened. I'm just happy that we made it out. That one was far too close. By now, a lot of people have heard about Hellhole. It's a very deep and narrow cave system that leads deep into the ground in the Germany Valley area of West Virginia. I, like most cave explorers, after hearing about Hellhole, decided to make the trip out there for myself to check it out and see how terrifying it truly was. And as while I'll say it was one of the best and most interesting adventures of my life, I can safely say that I will never be going back there. Now, most people will tell you that when you are going exploring to never go alone, and I agree wholeheartedly. However, I couldn't find anyone who would go with me at the time, so I made the foolish decision to visit Hellhole for the first time all by myself. The descent into Hellhole begins by squeezing through a small metal entryway that was originally placed there to keep explorers out of the tight and deadly caverns that lie beneath the ground. However, they gave up trying to seal off the entrance after it had been torn open and entered anyway. Now it's simply a place where you go at your own risk. If anything happens to you while you're in Hellhole, no one can come and bring you out. It's far too narrow for that. And again, I was foolishly doing this exploration alone. As I made my descent into the cave system, I could see right away why Hellhole was considered an expert's only plunge. I had done a lot of research beforehand, and thanks to lines that had already been placed down there by those who have previously visited the hole, I was able to keep my way and know that I was heading in the proper direction. For a few holes that I had to squeeze through, I made sure to lead myself in the legs first and keep my arms free to ensure that I didn't get stuck, and this worked out for a while. I managed to spend about an hour and a half inside of Hellhole before deciding to head back. I had just reached a chamber that I had descended into from a small narrow crack that led into the chamber from above. Once I was inside, I sat for a while, caught my breath, and took in the signs of the crystals that used to line the wall before being broke by other explorers. I looked around me and back up the hole that I had come down from and began assessing exactly how I would maneuver my way back up. I figured I could go with my right arm first and sort of wiggle and wedge my way upward through the pass. Sadly, I miscalculated, and after pulling myself upward into the passage, I stopped. With the angle that the tunnel went, I would have had to tilt my body to the side, and the angle I had gone up at had caused me to get wedged in the narrow pass that was no wider than my chest. I couldn't even take in a full breath as I was stuck, which didn't help with my attempts to stay calm. I did everything I could to try to work my way out of that position, but the more I moved, the more I feared that I was getting wedged even worse. Panic began to set in, and as I came to the realization that I might be stuck in that position, and even if someone had found me, there would be very little that they could do to help me out. If I couldn't force my way through or back into the chamber below, I was theoretically trapped for good. The more I began to panic, the more I began to wiggle, writhe, thrash my way around in hopes of breaking free. And then, everything went black. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up. But as I slowly opened my eyes, I can only make out two things. The first being that I had somehow managed to end up on the floor of the chamber that I had been trying to climb out of, meaning I must have somehow gotten loose and fallen. The other thing I could make out clearly was the throbbing sensation that was going on in my head. That's when I realized that I must have knocked my head when I was in a panic, and perhaps it was my body going limp from being knocked unconscious, but I somehow managed to slip free. Now, I knew that if I were to attempt to escape from Hellhole again, I would have to be extremely cautious with every move I made not to get stuck again. And after really working it out, I decided to try to ascend out of the cave system once again. It took me about 3 hours of carefully picking my position, but I eventually made it back up into the open air. And after making it back to my car, I decided to go to the hospital to get my head checked out. There was a small wound where I'd hit my head that required 2 staples. But other than that, I was lucky to be alive and to have made it out of Hellhole altogether.